We've all been there, right? That racing heart, that pit in your stomach, that's anxiety. And while it can feel totally overwhelming, it's not some big, unsolvable mystery. It's actually a process, something happening in our brain and our body. And the cool thing is, once we understand it, we can learn to take back the controls.
I love this quote from Jodi Picoult. Anxiety is like a rocking chair. It gives you something to do, but it doesn't get you very far. It just perfectly captures that feeling of being stuck, doesn't it? All this frantic energy, all this motion, but you're not actually going anywhere. It's such a powerful way to think about that cycle of worry.
So that's the big question, right? How do we break that cycle and get out of the chair? Well, it all starts with understanding the machine that's doing the rocking in the first place, our very own brain.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, with our brain's built-in alarm system. Because here's the thing. To really get a handle on anxiety, we first need to understand a much more basic and actually incredibly useful emotion, fear.
The first thing you've got to remember is that fear itself isn't the enemy. Not at all. It's this ancient survival tool that's kept us alive for millennia. You see a snake in the woods, and your brain triggers that fear response way before you've even had time to consciously think, hey, that's a snake. That's your survival instinct kicking into high gear.
So who's in charge of this whole operation? Well, it's a tiny almond-shaped part of your brain called the amygdala. The best way to think of it is like a super-sensitive smoke detector. It is constantly scanning everything coming in from your senses, what you see, what you hear, what you feel, and it's just looking for any sign of a threat. And when it thinks it's found one, bam, it sounds the alarm. Now that alarm system is a lifesaver, for sure. But what happens when it gets a little too sensitive? What if it starts going off not just for a real fire, but for a piece of burnt toast? Or even just the smell of smoke? Well, that's when we start getting into the territory of anxiety.
So how does something totally harmless suddenly become terrifying? Well, it happens through a process called fear conditioning. In those classic experiments, a mouse hears a sound, and it's no big deal. But if you pair that sound with a little shock over and over again, its brain learns to connect the two. And pretty soon, just the sound by itself is enough to trigger a full-blown fear response. A harmless sound becomes a learned trigger.
And look, this isn't just about mice in a lab, right? This happens to us all the time. Think about someone who's been in a really bad car accident on the highway. Before, the highway was just a road, but because it got paired with this really traumatic event, it could become a trigger. Now, just the sight of big trucks or the sound of tires screeching can set off that fear alarm. That's a huge part of what's going on in disorders like PTSD.
And you might think that experiencing that kind of trauma is rare, but it's really not. The data shows that the vast majority of us, up to 75%, will go through a significant traumatic event at some point in our lives. That's 3 out of every 4 people.
But, and this is so important, here's the really hopeful part. Even though most of us experience trauma, only about 7% of people go on to develop PTSD. So what's the difference? It comes down to resilience. For most people, the brain kind of recalibrates itself. It learns that, hey, most highways are actually safe, and that alarm system starts to quiet back down on its own.
This shows us what's actually happening on a biological level. In people with anxiety disorders, that amygdala, our fear alarm, is stuck in overdrive. As you can kind of see from the chart, brain scans show that when faced with a potential threat, the amygdala in an anxious brain just lights up way more intensely. The alarm is just too sensitive.
Okay, so that might sound a little bleak, but this is where the whole story turns around. This is the hopeful part, because if fear can be learned, it makes perfect sense that it can also be unlearned. Our brains are not set in stone. They can be rewired.
This process of unlearning is called fear extinction. It's basically the flip side of the coin. If that mouse keeps hearing the tone over and over again, but the shock never comes, its brain learns a new, updated lesson. Oh, this tone is safe now. And slowly but surely, that fear response starts to fade away.
And this isn't just some theory. It's the science behind one of the most effective treatments we have for anxiety. It's called exposure therapy. It's where you systematically and in a totally safe way encounter your triggers. You get back on the highway. And when the bad thing you're so afraid of doesn't happen, your brain gets retrained. You're teaching the amygdala that it was a false alarm, helping it unlearn that fear it held onto.
But rewiring that physical fear response is only half the battle. A huge part of managing anxiety is also about the stories we tell ourselves. Those anxious thoughts that just keep fueling the fire.
Life is messy, right? It's full of gray areas and ambiguous situations. And for a brain with a sensitive fear alarm, that ambiguity is like fertile ground for anxiety to grow.
A core habit of anxious thinking is this tendency to automatically fill in the blanks with the absolute worst-case scenario.
Just look at these examples because this makes it really clear. A friend doesn't text you back. A benign or neutral interpretation is just, oh, they must be busy. But the anxious interpretation is, they're definitely mad at me. Or your heart starts racing. Is it because you're excited, or are you having a heart attack? See, in every case, the anxious brain just reflexively jumps to the most threatening conclusion, and it turns a totally neutral event into a source of fear.
And this is where therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, come in. And I really want to stress this point. The goal here isn't to just force positive thinking or pretend everything's perfect. It's about becoming a detective of your own thoughts, to notice that automatic negative jump, to challenge it, and to consciously practice seeing the other possibilities. It's all about developing a more balanced and realistic perspective.
All right, so we've talked about therapy, but beyond that, we can actively build up our own resilience to stress through simple, daily practices that strengthen both our brain and our body.
You know how our body has a gas pedal, that fight-or-flight stress response? Well, the good news is it also has a brake. It's called the relaxation response, and it is the literal physiological opposite of fight or flight. It actively calms your body down, lowering your heart rate and blood pressure, basically telling your amygdala that the threat has passed and it's safe to stand down.
And we can intentionally hit that brake pedal. Things like mindful breathing and meditation are powerful ways to activate this relaxation response. And the basics, regular exercise, a healthy diet, and getting good sleep, they do more than just make you feel better. They physically build a more resilient brain that's just less likely to send out those false alarms in the first place.
So when you boil it all down, remember, anxiety isn't a character flaw. It's not you. It's just a sign of a fear alarm that's working a little too hard. And by understanding the science behind it, we can learn how to recalibrate it. We can unlearn old fears, challenge those anxious thoughts, and build our resilience every single day. So I'll just leave you with this. What's one small step you can take to manage your fear alarm today?